the next event is called Traditional Knowledge and the Section 106 process. And this is a panel event. We have some really incredible panelists here. And so it's the same format. If you have joined any other session, it's the same format that we've used throughout the summit. We're going to have our panelists speak. And then at the end, we'll have a community discussion and question and answer session. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please put those in the Q&A box, and then we'll do a moderated discussion at the end. And okay, Jamie, if you want to take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jamie Lee Marks. I'm going to kick it off to our Director of the Office of Native American Affairs, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, Ira Matt.
Hessel halt, everybody. Ira Matt, Louis Quest, Chines Salish, Ichin Hess, Quest Exchange. I said, good day to everybody. My name's Ira Matt. I'm Salish. More correctly, I guess I'm a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. I am doing good, and how is everybody out there today? Just want to start this off by saying, thank you for organizing this event and allowing us the opportunity to be here. We know there's probably a lot of people that want to participate, and providing us a space to come and really talk to you about a bunch of federal processes, probably not the most exciting thing, but we can always use the support of a group like this. So time's tight, and we're hoping to have a great conversation. So we're going to get moving. I'm the director of the ACHP's Office of Native American Affairs. ACHP is the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. And our presentation today is addressing the incorporation of Indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge into federal decision-making. And in particular, we're talking about the arena of historic preservation. For everybody who's not familiar, we're talking about cultural resources, historic properties, sacred sites, archaeology. So today we're going to briefly introduce you to our agency and our office, the efforts we've taken to advance Indigenous knowledge in this regulatory structure that we work in. And we're going to go through how we developed our recent information paper that came out in July 2021. And we'll talk a bit about the path forward, guidance and training, interagency efforts, and our role to advise other agencies, the President and Congress. So, and of course, it's not listed on here, but one of the things that we're most interested in is the conversation afterwards, hearing from everybody, questions you guys have, the comments, the guidance and advice. So next slide, Jamie Lee. So just to catch everybody up, because you probably don't know much about our agency, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, we're a small independent agency, and we have between 35 to 40 full-time staff. And what we are is the primary federal policy advisor to the President and Congress. We recommend administrative and legislative improvements for protecting the nation's diverse heritage, what I mentioned before, historic preservation. A key function of our agency is overseeing the Federal Historic Preservation Review Process, or Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. And we'll go over it in some more detail, but quick summary. Section 106 requires federal agencies to consider the effects of their projects through consultation that are carried out by them or subject to their assistance and approval. And the ACHP's role in this is that we're given the responsibility to assist those federal agencies in their efforts and to ensure that they consider preservation in their project planning. And just for anybody who might not know, what it means to be an independent federal agency is that we exist outside other departments so that we can operate with some increased autonomy, which is necessary when we're advising on the implementation of regulations so that we're not inappropriately influenced by being part of a larger department. Go ahead and jump to the next one, Jamie Lee. So in particular, our office, the Office of Native American Affairs, we advise on matters pertaining to Indian tribes, Native Hawaiians, and other indigenous peoples in the field of historic preservation. Excuse me. You can see that we have a number of initiatives on the screen there. And these are basically focus areas for us that we've identified, or that tribes or Native Hawaiians have requested that we create additional guidance on to help inform federal agencies as it pertains to that intersection to these focus areas with historic preservation. As you guys can see, climate change and cultural resources is a big concern. We're talking about traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge today. These are all areas where our office works to try to help inform and educate. We're also appointed to work with the White House Council on Native American Affairs. We oversee our agency's compliance with Executive Order 13175, consultation and coordination with tribal governments, and any other number of issues that address the culture of Indigenous people worldwide. So we're here today. We have a huge staff, all 3 permanent full-time staff and 1 contract employee to manage this workload. We are fortunate enough to get some interns to help us in the summertime, something that maybe we could find some more volunteers for next year. But I want to introduce our staff. We're missing 1 today. William Dancing Feather is a member of the Washoe tribe, former tribal leader, and he's worked at the advisory council for about 10-15 years. He was unable to be with us today, but I do want to kick it over to Ahwahnee Williams right now for a brief introduction.
Thank you, Ira. Manahu, my name is Ahwahnee Williams. I am a citizen of the Bishop Paiute tribe from the Paiute, which is in Central Eastern California. I am currently a part-time employee with the ACHP in the Office of Native American Affairs. And I just wanted to say kudos to everybody in the planning process of this conference. It's been amazing and an honor to be a part of. So I will hand the virtual mic over to Jamie Lee.
Hi everyone, my name is Jamie Lee Marks. I'm a senior analyst in our office, and I'm so excited to be here with everybody today. Again, I'll echo my colleagues and just say thanks for having us. Before working here at the Advisory Council, I worked with the Tribal Historic Preservation Program. So I think this is a good jumping off point for me to just give some general background on the NHPA and how it impacts the parameters of what we're going to be sharing with and asking y'all about today. So as many of you probably know, the National Historic Preservation Act, which I'll be an annoying fed just called the NHPA unless anyone virtually slaps me through the chat or something, which I would also totally understand, was first passed in 1966. It was a part of a cultural and legislative movement to protect the national cultural heritage from what was viewed as rampant federal development, right? So that was the context of the passage of the first NHPA. There was a major update in 1992 that I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a few slides. But to jump into some of the provisions of the Act itself, one of the major things that it did was establish a National Register of Historic Places. That is a crucial component to compliance with the rest of the law, an important thing to know. It also said, hey, states, we're going to have y'all designate a lead person in your state to liaise with federal agencies and a whole bunch of other people about the impact of federal undertakings on historic sites in your state. And that includes maintaining an inventory, having on staff an archaeologist, a historian. So really called on states to have a lead for the state, for the entire state. I'm sure you see where I'm going with that for historic preservation. Another thing, and I feel like there's something missing on this slide, which is fun. Ah, there we go. There are other sections of the law that are very important for our discussion today. One is, of course, Section 106, which Ira already mentioned a little bit, but that mandates federal agencies must take into account the effects of actions on historic properties. And then afford the Advisory Council, on historic preservation a reasonable opportunity to comment. Section 110 is another part of the law that's helpful to know. It mandated that federal agencies will have their own preservation programs and directed them to be stewards of any historic sites under their jurisdiction, including, of course, the identification of them, evaluation, and so forth. It also established us, yay, hi. So that's another, to me, very important part of the law. This is an awesome graphic, okay, for us all. For me, it's an afternoon on the East Coast, so I find that graphics are really helpful, but just giving a little bit more information about the Section 106 review process. The process requires agencies to consider, again, the impacts of undertakings, which are defined as projects, activities, or programs that are funded, permitted, licensed, or approved under the direct or indirect jurisdiction of a federal agency. So again, if you're interested in this work and how to get involved in this work, it's really important to know the full breadth of things that could be considered a federal undertaking. And this, of course, includes properties with religious and cultural significance to tribes and Native Hawaiians. All right, another fun graphic, which makes me very excited, is, when we talk about the Section 106 review process, there are 4 steps, major steps to the process, but you'll notice that consultation it fuels all of these processes, right? So from the very beginning, tribes are involved in step 1, initiating the process with a federal agency determining is what we're doing an undertaking, and from there identifying tribes and tribal historic preservation officers, which I'll talk about in a second, that might be interested in the undertaking. From there, identifying historic properties. Well, I'm sure you can see where this presentation is about to go, but I'll save that for Ira. But how are you going to identify historic properties, right, on lands that are significant or ancestral lands of tribes, if you are an outsider and know nothing about what you're talking about? Not that anyone's that. I'm not. No shade, no shade. From there, assessing adverse effects, right? Resolving adverse effects. And I don't want to steal too much of the content that's going to be discussed later, but you can see at each of these stages, if there's a yes, you keep going. If there's a no, it's an out, and it's really an administrative process. So it's a procedural law meant to make sure that federal agencies are adequately considering the impacts of their projects. So those fun 1992 amendments I alluded to, major update, right? So after years of work by advocates and tribal, cultural, and historic preservation experts and allies, right, in states and federal service, there was a huge update that more fully integrated tribes into the law in many ways. I recommend to folks that are interested in this reading the publication Keepers of the Treasures to read about some of the information and interview research that was done to advocate for these changes. And one of the lines that I think is really impactful from that report is the recommendation that tribes are participants in the National Historic Preservation Program, Federal Preservation Program in general, on their own terms. And we are still working to this day in the federal family and otherwise to ensure that provision of on their own terms is something that is fully realized. So of course, a major update, that the clarification that properties of religious and cultural significance to tribes and Native Hawaiians may be eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, and the requirement that federal agencies consult with tribes and Native Hawaiians when historic properties of religious and cultural significance to them may be affected. The other major change that I love to talk about, so if this is your thing and you want to talk about it later, let's reconnect about it in another time, is the Tribal Historic Preservation Program. So this law also said, hey, you know how we said every state needs to appoint a state historic preservation officer that'll be the lead consulting party on, these projects for the state? That's a kind of weird thing to do on tribal lands, right? Maybe that's not always the best call. So it created a provision whereby tribes could petition the Department of the Interior through the Park Service to take on those same responsibilities. That, of course, the law was passed in 1992. It took until 1996 for the first wave, so to speak, of 12 TIPO applications to be approved. Shortly after that, in 1999, regulations were updated, incorporating the other items I mentioned above. And then I believe, when we talk about the TIPO numbers, you have 1996, there's 12. Today, there are 208. So you can see, we've got 1966, this program saying we really need to have on a national scale the identification of historic properties done by state. How many years between that and 1996 and today had tribes not been fully, invited to participate in that process? So when we think about evaluation and gaps in our knowledge that is necessary to even do this work comprehensively, that's something to keep in mind. The other thing that I think is really worth saying about this is as the program grows, and by that I mean the number of agreements with TIPOs grows, funding has not grown at the same pace. And so the first round of funding, we saw $80,000 average per program, and now we're seeing more like $50,000. When you think about the scale of work, which again, like I said, I'll get off my soapbox about the TIFA program in a second, just isn't adequate, right? So there are a lot of challenges, among them that this is all organized around the National Register of Historic Places, and of course tribes have their own often registers of historic places, and that promise of inviting tribes and Native Hawaiians to participate in the National Historic Preservation Program on their own terms, I think still needs some thought work from all of us. So definitely inviting everyone interested to get engaged in that future discussion. So just some comments from the 1999 update to the regs, right? We've got agencies are required to provide tribes the opportunity to identify their concerns about historic properties, advise on the evaluation of historic properties, articulate their views on an undertaking's effect on historic properties, and participate in the resolution of any possible adverse effects to those properties. Oh, and with this, I will kick it back to Ira.
Yeah, Jamie Lee's not kidding. She's really into that. I'm a former tribal historic preservation officer, and I know she gets farther into the details than I, but I mean, she was real nice about it. The summary was National Historic Preservation Act developed at a time when, it's termination era, right? Tribes weren't included, finally got a seat at the table 30 years later. It's been 30 years since that time, essentially, and there's still a lot of improvements that are needed. And that kind of brings us, let me find my little bullet points here, to kind of where we're going at with this paper. This process is about feds and their requirements to take into account their impacts to areas that might be important to us as tribal people, to those sites of Native Hawaiian people, and to just Americans in general. The structure, academic structure, the legal structure has benefited and has been built into that in that regard, inconsistent with that of Indigenous people worldwide. So consistent with our agency mission, one way that the Office of Native American Affairs has represented the interest of tribes and Native Hawaiians is through the development of this Indigenous Knowledge information paper, which is really designed to inform federal agencies of their responsibilities to include this knowledge in their decision-making process. It was not crafted, and this is important to know right off, as an official guidance document, and we can get into that later. This first step is meant to create awareness of Indigenous knowledge and identify the role that this information has in a federal agency's Section 106 compliance efforts. And really, I guess briefly, we took the tact of working with those people who wanted to know and to do it right, as we build towards being a little bit more firm with guidance, training, etc. Now, this paper that we have, it was developed in collaboration with tribes, Native Hawaiians, Native Hawaiian organizations. We did a series of nationwide Zoom calls. We shared the drafts for direct edits. We had calls, emails, in-person meetings. The one big thing to know right off is we did not define Indigenous knowledge in this paper. We couldn't do it. Rather, what we did at the Advisory Council is we provided the platform for tribes and Native Hawaiians to discuss this knowledge in their own terms. They sent in their characterization, we attached it to the paper. Our role was to merely define when that knowledge should be considered by a federal agency in that regulatory structure that Jamie Lee went through. So we basically focused on amplifying tribal Native Hawaiian voices and clarifying where agencies needed to account for that information. Next slide, Jamie Lee. So the ACHP, I mean, we recognize that each Indian tribe, Native Hawaiian organization, they have a unique understanding of traditional knowledge relative to their cultural beliefs, practices. We didn't want to define it, but what the ACHP can say is that the integration of that knowledge into project planning can help ensure that those identification, evaluation efforts that were mentioned earlier meet the regulatory requirements so that the agency can, and this is one of these little terms of art, make a reasonable and good faith effort. So in order for us to basically hold them accountable to have informed decision-making, we need to show them what's necessary to achieve that, especially when it hadn't been properly articulated before. This is also big from a federal agency's side because consideration of this knowledge from tribes and Hawaiians, it really shows respect that they're taking their responsibility seriously. They recognize the value of these practices to the people. And it's important to understand from the outset as well that this knowledge is frequently utilized by tribes, Native Hawaiians, to identify these historic properties of religious and cultural significance. And you'll hear us use that term because that's a term in the regulations. And that's why all these graphics, Bill Dancing Feather put them on here. He put them on here to show that there's a wide array of knowledge that needs to be considered that can be significant to these locations. And that's why the Advisory Council is focusing on Indigenous knowledge, right? It was a concern raised by Indian tribes and Native Hawaiians, but as we just mentioned, it didn't really account for it. You know, the termination era, 1966 was just not a very Indian-friendly time. And despite the 92 amendments, the regulations weren't updated until 99. So you had a 7-year gap on how to implement some of those changes. And even at that time, the language in the regulations was not explicit in the consideration of Indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, any of these terms that, you know, you can see related with what we're talking about. And without that, it made it difficult for non-Indigenous people to understand where to incorporate this. So this paper helps tease out some of those nuances for those unfamiliar with how to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into their Section 106 reviews. Next slide, Jamie Lee. Oh, so the key messages of this paper is really that traditional knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, it's defined by the tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations in the 106 process. Basically, where these need to inform those identification, evaluation, if it's information provided by the tribes, it is that knowledge. And no federal agency personnel or federal contractors are able to provide that perspective. The paper affirms that federal agencies required to consult with tribes, Native Hawaiians. It acknowledges that tribes and Native Hawaiians have special expertise. And you'll see more about those particular words. And that is how traditional knowledge is frequently expressed in that consultation process. It clarifies that agencies must integrate that shared knowledge into their decision-making. And that includes identification, evaluation, the assessment of effects, and any sort of resolution that comes out of it. And of course, we're going to hit this a number of times with them in here. Traditional knowledge may be confidential. It should be approached respectfully and appropriately protected during and after those review processes. Next slide, Jamie. So you've seen some of this before. This is some of the language that Jamie Lee was mentioning earlier. This is a picture of the statute. But federal agencies have a responsibility to make a reasonable and good faith effort to identify any Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization that might attach religious and cultural significance to a historic property in their project area. And this requirement applies regardless of the location. So it doesn't matter if it's private land, federal land, if it's an undertaking, they must take it into account. And one way that the regulations in 99 did do a good job is they were clear that this could happen on ancestral, Aboriginal, or ceded lands of Indian tribes. There was that advanced awareness that because of forest removal, shifting territories through time, and all the other dynamics that have gone into the movements of our people since time immemorial, we are not confined to cede land specifically from a treaty or where somebody, an anthropologist from 1900, identified our areas of interest. These are areas that the tribes may have a connection to. Next slide, please. So the language on the screen, referencing special expertise. This is taken directly from the regulations that guide the 106 process. This is what I referenced back to before. The paper that we drafted clarifies that this term special expertise, which is as close as I got to you talking about traditional or indigenous knowledge, this includes place names, oral history, ethnobotany, land use, and all other types of knowledge shared or presented by an Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization. But unfortunately, many people assume that an agency, archaeologist, a contractor can identify these historic properties of religious and cultural significance to Indian tribes or Native Hawaiians. You heard Jamie Lee mention that at one point in time, all lands, all resources, a state official was appointed to oversee that. So this paper, as we're starting to see those amendments kick in and the development of all these tribal historic preservation offices who are taking back that lead and defining what's important to us, this paper helps clarify that we don't care if you're a contractor, federal agency personnel, an enthusiast, an academic, you do not possess the appropriate expertise to determine what properties are or are not of significance to an Indian tribe or a Native Hawaiian. The appropriate individual to carry out such a determination is a representative designated by the tribal government or the Native Hawaiian organization. And I got a little quote here, I'm going to pull it up. This came from my boss. When Jamie Lee mentioned the first 12 TIPOs in '96, she was one of them. She started the program shortly before I got there. In American Indian Quarterly, I think in 2001, she said, quote, "For too long, we have watched the extraction of our traditional knowledge from our elders. Knowledge used not for the benefit of our people, but to launch a professional career or create a professional expert on our tribal lifeways. These careers have been built on the shoulders of our elders, the true PhDs of our culture." And she was kind of a visionary at her time, helped inspire a lot of the changes to the regulations that did occur. But we are 20 years later, still working to implement this because of how slow the wheels of government can turn. Go ahead and jump to the next slide. So for this paper, some of this has been stated, but I just want to reinforce the fact that within this Section 106 process, that every federal project, whether they're carrying it out, funding it, permitting it, or licensing it, when they're going through it, special expertise includes traditional indigenous knowledge. Agencies must acknowledge and consider this knowledge to adequately account for that significance and integrity of those historic properties. And I noted before, information, not guidance, right? This is a first step. By creating awareness and providing people the context necessary to understand the value and the role of this knowledge, we're building a foundation for future collaborative efforts. Next slide. So for my last one for this section on the paper, ACHP, again, we're not defining this knowledge. We're providing a platform for people, so we're going to elevate it. It's the knowledge brought by tribal people, Native Hawaiians, other indigenous people. And the fact that TK is brought by representatives of tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations really reinforces the sovereignty of those people to represent their own culture. And unfortunately, many of us on here that have been around a little bit longer, we've been subject to arguing with a report that was written or some other record developed by an outsider, somebody outside our culture, outside our lifeways. Hopefully this paper is going to reduce that reality, and federal agencies will learn to rely on tribal and Native Hawaiian counterparts as a primary source of information, or to help determine for that written record, what is the reliable source. So this knowledge, it's information. Our goal is to clarify that. And really, it's as valid as Western sciences for anything it wants to justify. And while historically Western science has always marginalized tribal lifeways and knowledge by equating them with terms that ultimately undermine their significance, the ACHP stands firm. The traditional knowledge of a tribe or Native Hawaiian organization is as valid in determining the significance and integrity of their sites as Western science is for theirs. And that's kind of the role for the paper. I'm going to turn it back, or actually, what's the next slide, Jamie? I'm not even sure. Oh yeah, this is still me. I apologize for everybody that was ready for me to be done. This is just a quick summary of some of our efforts. I talked about our path forward. This administration is obviously opening a lot of doors. It's happening fast. We've got a lot of tribal people in high places. So we're working on the Indigenous Traditional Ecological Knowledge Work Group. I believe those folks were presenting here the other day. We're working on climate change. We're not only working at it at an agency level, we're working at it with the White House Council. And we've actually pushed in the progress reports to have Indigenous knowledge considered. So when agencies get the progress report questions, it's going to come out and it's going to ask, how have you considered Indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, whatever term we use? And not only where have you considered it in this plan, where else in your agency structure, from granting to technical standards to other contracting requirements, could you further incorporate consideration of traditional knowledge? So we've been able to utilize some of these platforms to help advance this. We're part of the Interagency Sacred Sites MOU. I was just working with the Department of Energy in St. Louis. As a matter of fact, I just got back a couple hours ago, talking to them about the coordination between that MOU and the consideration and respect for sacred sites and Indigenous knowledge. So we're doing a lot, but one of the areas we're really proud of, and I'll turn it to Ahwahnee to talk more, is the efforts we have with Salish Kootenai College. Because as much as we love to try to educate a Fed like myself, we're all getting a little bit old. So we're working now a lot more with Native youth, which has been a request of the tribes and Native Hawaiians. And we're trying to bring in, not trying to educate them on Indigenous knowledge, but we're working to help them understand how policy influences those considerations. And with the interns that we're bringing in through that college, we're trying to have them work as the future of this industry on identifying ways that we can better educate, guidance that needs to be implemented, and training that could happen. But I'm going to turn it over to Ahwahnee so she can just briefly recount the college and the program for you.
So Salish Kootenai College is often referred to as SKC. SKC is on the homelands of the Salish Kootenai and Pend Oreille people in beautiful northwestern Montana. Salish Kootenai College is currently home to the only undergraduate degree in tribal historic preservation program in the nation. The undergraduate program builds upon a broad range of learning in historic preservation, Indigenous science, cultural resource management, GIS applications. There's Salish and Kootenai language component, and also a field school requirement, like a 4-week program in Yellowstone. So SKC is ultimately cultivating tribal historic preservation practitioners. In September of 2019, the ACHP Foundation entered into an agreement with Salish Kootenai College, creating an internship program for SKC students in the preservation department. So the internship definitely provides opportunities, as Ira mentioned, for assisting with development in draft guidance, information papers, consultation, and also training programs. So programs like this agreement with the ACHP is vital, as Ira mentioned, for students, Native American students, learning public policy and implementation.
Thank you, Ahwahnee. And I was going to answer a question. Apparently, I'm going to do it live. Yeah, Salish Kootenai College is a tribal college at TCU. It's located on my reservation, back home, right across the street from where I worked for 16 years at the tribal government offices. So great college. And that's, I think, where Ahwahnee and I first crossed paths years ago when we were working to implement this MOU. She's worked as an intern and now she's come on as an employee. And it's completely going off on tangents here, right? But what I find is so great about it is, from being back there out west, from being in the res, working for the tribe, it's those types of voices that DC needs to hear more from to help inform and educate. Because believe it or not, for all the decision makers out here, there's still a lot of need for them to understand how to make that big decision in DC trickle down to influence those local level actions. So it's been fun, and you know, we had a lot of in-person engagement prior to COVID. We'd go out to the field schools up in Glacier Park, and she said Yellowstone. We'd do in-person lectures and coordinate, and a lot of this was bringing that DC down to the local reservation level and providing students that opportunity to also be there to see and influence policy development, so that they can understand that even if you want to do field work, if you want to stay at that local level, the capacity of that to influence what's happening back in DC at the policy level, and how really that's a reciprocal relationship between the two. So anyway, that's something I'll get on my soapbox about. And last thing I'll mention, though, before I turn it over to Jamie Lee, is this bottom bullet, right? This Indigenous Knowledge policy. It's something that we're actually going to talk to our committee about next week. We have our staff at the advisory council, but we're overseen by a 24-member council. These are presidentially appointed, statutorily identified. You know, the Secretary of Interior, Secretary of Ag. But we meet 3 times a year, and that's how you drive the policy and the decision making at the advisory council. That's how we inform the president and Congress, is through this council. And as one of our next steps, as we noted, we want to go from this information to a policy and guidance. And we're going to pitch policy to the advisory council and see if they are open to setting the foundation for moving forward, to take a bit more of a firm stance, and instead of advising, somewhat directing as we go forward. And we're excited about it. You know, hopefully we can report out next year on the development of this policy and the products that are going to come out of it specifically. But we're building, and you know, we're excited to hear more from you guys about your thoughts on that. But I'll turn it over to Jamie Lee to finish this up in the next 7 minutes, I think.
Yeah, I mean, 7 minutes for all the opportunities and challenges. I'm going to triage here because there's nothing but challenge and opportunity here. You know, on a personal note, you know, I'm sure that I'm not the only person who feels this way, but the reason that I am excited to work within federal regulations and in this zone is because it's a tool, right? It's one of the many tools that are out there to think about how can we hold federal agencies accountable for living up to their trust responsibility to Native nations and in here. So for me, talking about policy is exciting for that reason, because, you know, strategizing ahead of, if here's language and law, how can we strategize to make sure that we're doing the most we can with that language? I don't know. So if you're like that, please, like Ira said, it's opportunity to engage people about potentially working with us in the future. Anyways, we're around. So opportunities and challenges. Indigenous knowledge is essential to the process for all of the reasons that Ira has outlined and more, but requires trust and may take time. That timeline doesn't always sync up exactly with federal expectations around timelines, right? With the we need comments in 30 days doesn't really connect with all of the full scale of framework for not only the nation to nation component of thinking about engaging with a federal agency, especially given the track record of how federal agencies have chosen to use what's shared with them by Native nations and communities, but also internal processes that I'm going to talk about in a second. I'm sure many of us are very familiar with on this in the summit of within a community, right? There needs to be permission often to gather, and the word on the PowerPoint here is use, but when you don't know what an agency could potentially do, the full scale of what it could do with the information you share, it makes it even harder to make those determinations, right? Protocols. So all too often, folks go into a process of, hey, we need information about whether you think there are sites in this area that could be impacted, and protocol discussions come later versus starting with that awareness of, wow, I know that asking these questions could lead to some sensitive information being discussed. Maybe we should discuss protocol and how this needs to go down right at the very beginning. Confidentiality. So confidentiality is a huge concern in this space. The National Historic Preservation Act does have a provision. I gotta get my notes when numbers are involved. Sorry. 304 that is meant to protect information about historic properties that could, if leaked, right, lead to disturbance, looting, or any other potential negative effects. But the lead agency on the consultation is the agency that determines whether the information fits within 304. And Ira, please jump in and correct me on 304. You have much more experience than I do. But what I do have experience with is, as someone who used to work for a different federal agency, was, oh, well, this was necessary to show that we completed 106, so we're going to put all these details in the administrative record. And it's like, do you have to put all of those details in the administrative record to say that you've completed 106, or can you get creative and talk to consulting nations about how to potentially record that in a respectful way? I have been involved in those discussions, and they can get really upsetting, especially when the best guidance out there is, as soon as the federal official has begun to assemble information about properties, they need to be talking about and thinking about how to manage that information. And that, frankly, is a frontier that we need a lot of help with and support with from everybody. There may be different views on a property related to knowledge about practices or anything related to a site or property, and each are valid. So that's definitely always a challenge. And then this has been communicated here, but I think in other presentations I've been sitting on, that the consistent need to remind people that it's not Western science says this, and we can validate Indigenous knowledge with Western science, but that Indigenous knowledge is a valid and sufficient form of information on its own. And as Ira kind of keyed towards when he was talking, sometimes even people with the best intentions can use language that inadvertently communicates that some knowledge is expertise and some is not, and trying to steer people in policy and guidance as far away from that as we possibly can to try to dismantle some of those barriers to the respect that Indigenous knowledge deserves. Yeah, I have a whole nother, a graphic. I'm in the afternoons, graphics and we get along. So, harm and permission. How, especially when you're talking about external federal officials here, it's how do you even understand what harm can look like, right? The very act of recording, writing down, or sharing can even cause harm. And what I mentioned in the slide before, talking about the nation-to-nation relationship between tribes in the United States aside, what other cultural and legal protocols internally could exist that would govern access and use of Indigenous knowledge? So for communities, they're thinking about community members, elders, preservation boards, cultural committees, elder advisory boards, and the federal timeline sometimes doesn't match up with all of the processes that are necessary internally. And that's definitely a challenge as well. Ira, did you want to jump in on this?
No, I think just go ahead and try and bring it to conclusion.
I saw you light up and I was like, I don't know.
Hey, Jamie, we
Okay.
might, if you have some final thoughts on your presentation, it might be a good time to share those so we can get in a few
Oh,
questions and do the moderated question and answer series before we have to wrap up.
yeah, that's great. So I know that Ira, you were gonna go over this, but I'll just kind of try to bring it home. So we've got some information out there. Please visit our website. We've got our Indigenous Knowledge paper, of course, more information about the Native Youth Program, some training and e-learning modules, and some guidance around Section 104 of the NHPA and protecting sensitive information. I would encourage you to read that, read for and against the grain on that one. What does it do and what more can it do and what more tools do we need to do? And with that, Ira, anything else about it you want to add?
No, I think that was great. I mean, confidentiality is always going to be the challenge, and that is really something for, I mean, this next generation to look at. But I think that's it. We can show them the next slide that says our names and questions, and we're just here to answer anything that you guys want to know about that we can help with.
So the first question, actually, first, let me thank you all. I mean, that was a really great presentation, and I appreciate how you walked us through the Section 106 process and helped us think about ways that your department is incorporating traditional ecological knowledge and Indigenous voices into these processes, especially traditional ecological knowledge and other forms of Indigenous science too, right? I mean, TEK is not the only form of Indigenous science that we have. I also really appreciate how you have reflected on the voices that need to be heard in policymaking processes too, especially Indigenous peoples and, the people who are on our reservations and not just Indigenous academics, which is sometimes, sometimes we hold a lot of more power in our voices as academics. So that's important. So the first question that was asked is, do you often hear of concerns related to tribal data sovereignty under this act? And I know that Jamie provided an answer to that, but Jamie, if you want to talk about that, or if anyone else does, feel free to.
Yeah, I mean, so data sovereignty is fascinating because I'm on a work group now trying to identify more about data sovereignty and its role. It's being brought up in that term data sovereignty a lot more, but it shares so many of those same foundations with just making sure that the information that's being utilized in decision making comes from the proper source, right? And that's where I think you hit on it well. I use this term in my training just because I can, and I like to use it with feds. Federal agencies will have any Indian syndrome. And so when they go to do something, they talk to an Indian, they feel like they've taken the voice of the tribe and they're good to go. And it's always reminding them that there is clearly a designated representative, a tribal historic preservation officer, or some other appointed official who represents the tribe in that political relationship. Everybody, well, maybe you guys don't know, I mean, Indian tribes, it's not an ethnic group, it's a political entity. And that's where that government to government relationship comes in. So when we start to look at the concepts of data sovereignty, it's making sure that it's coming from the appropriate sources, first of all. And that's where we're even trying to build in the respect for the protocols and the processes that exist and can come under that framework that Jamie Lee was talking about for the tribal historic preservation officers to really be able to identify how their databases are going to be interfaced with outsiders and how that information should or could be used to an extent. Because everybody has to understand one thing, FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. FOIA doesn't care if the government owns it, you own it, data sovereignty. What that says is per a certain request, the government has to justify its decision-making, and information that they've acquired for that, without one of the few limited exceptions in there, will be released. And this is some of the challenges we have. So that kind of beats around the bush on the question, but there's a lot that we look at all the time in it, which it's good that there's a lot that we can tackle, but it's bad because it's a lot of components to align to help strengthen things like data sovereignty and confidentiality.
That's a good answer. And I think that you hit at the roots of a lot of the importance of thinking about tribal data sovereignty. Our next question is, do you have any guidance or suggestions on establishing protocols for working groups / collaborators on Indigenous knowledges and culturally sensitive information. This person is going through the process right now and they're looking for some examples.
Could you read that question one more time?
Yep. Do you have any guidance or suggestions on establishing protocols for working groups / collaborators and Indigenous knowledge and culturally sensitive info?
So when you start talking about the protocols, I mean, for me, I'm going to look at the federal framework, and you got to figure out how you're going to align as what we call a consulting party in the process. So if you want to be a group that informs it or around traditional knowledge on informing those protocols, you got to fall under, we'll keep it limited to tribes, the tribal government. How will they accept that? And underneath our regulations, there's a 36 CFR 800.2 C2 IE. It clearly shows that the federal government, an agency, and a tribe can come to an agreement on how they're going to manage coordination, consultation, and that can be data acquisition and management. So as long as, you know, if you're working with the tribes in our structure, as long as it's coming through that government, that's something that can happen, and it can be built into agreements where if you have particular protocols around information sharing, and I'm missing the term right now, they have been affected. I know the Confederated tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation have a wonderful protocol that helps protect their information. It hasn't been tested in the courts, but it's something agencies agreed to regarding their utilization in current decision-making, but subsequent utilization of that information in other applications. Because Jamie Lee mentioned it, I kind of did, but we all know everybody loves to borrow a quote. Heck, I did it in this presentation. That can change context dramatically, and especially if that's used to represent the voice of a tribe in another situation, that can have some dramatic impact. So I would, for our section, my thought is you always have to work with the tribes in this arena. But as far as groups, I mean, the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers works in that arena. They're a nonprofit. They're not a federally recognized tribe, but they bring together tribes and they work with them to find a collective way to address issues that they can bring back independently and try to adopt to bring forward more of a unified movement. One of the challenges you always have, 574 individual nations, there is no unilateral voice for the tribes in this. And let's face it, project proponents are going to use that in some ways to drive wedges between it. And we hit on that with the fact that there's multiple voices out there. So again, kind of a no answer for you.
Were you thinking about a memorandum of understanding or a data sharing agreement? Is that what you were trying to hit on?
Yeah, data sharing agreement. There's a particular term for the one, and my old brain's been traveling a lot today, so I'll come up with it here in a few minutes.
Okay. The next question, and this is probably our last question, is from Sammy, and Sammy asks, can we hear the quote again that Ira provided that was written by Jamie? It made me tear up. Very powerful miigwech.
The quote was probably the one from Marcia Pablo about the elders. And so first of all, it was the article is Preservation as Perpetuation. It was from American Indian Quarterly, the winter 2001, volume 25, number 1. And she said, so for too long, we have watched the extraction of our traditional knowledge from our elders. Knowledge used not to benefit our people, but to launch a professional career or create a professional expert on our tribal lifeways. These careers have been built on the shoulders of our elders, the true PhDs of our culture. So that's the one. I hope I got it for you. And what Marcia did in this article, it came out again shortly after those regulations changed, is she talked about the 92 amendments to the National Historic Preservation Act, about how this was developed outside of the cultural construct of tribal people and the challenge of utilizing this legal framework to represent and protect and perpetuate our culture. So Marcia was, like I said, she's a genius. I got to grow up in this industry working for her. She was partnership oriented and was really just quite poetic in her words. Even when I was in trouble, I came away from those meetings feeling better about myself. So,
Awesome. Let's see if we can do, I guess we'll do one more question. As an advisory council, how do you hold the government accountable?
So it's regulations, right? We have the statute, which doesn't say much. You have the regulations, which expands 3 or 4 sentences about section 106 to about 16 pages. We try to fill in what we continue to uncover as gray areas through policy is our highest level, guidance, information paper. Here's the challenge though. We're doing what we can to make sure that it's as transparent as possible. So if there's a flaw or a failure by an agency, you can hold them accountable. The only enforcement mechanism is taking it to litigation. We can't do that. We're an advisory council. That's the unfortunate reality of the ACHP. Yes, we constructed the regulations. We advise the president and Congress, but we cannot enforce anything. The agreements that come out of it, programmatic agreements and memorandums of agreement, are legally enforceable documents that get taken to court all the time. And what we've learned over the years is there's too much, subjective terms. The courts maybe sometimes don't have people who fully understand this either. So we're building as much clarity as we can. So hopefully we don't have the issues, but if it does go to court, the tribes, the citizens of the United States, its individual tribal members can take this to litigation and hold the agency accountable.
And can I pop in and say, just to tie it all with a bow here, that is the reason why having these documents that so clearly say special expertise in the laws interpreted by our agency to include Indigenous knowledge can be so important, to give that tool, more depth when courts are going to interpret things more broadly.
Yeah, no, that's a good ending point, Jamie. Ahwahnee, Ira, and Jamie, thank you so much for your time, Mado. I appreciate it. I think that you provided some interesting points of reflection and learning for folks at the summit today. I appreciate you sending in an abstract and coming here today. So Mado, thank you so much.